Welcome. This is Mike Cranky with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. We have with us today Lori Weigel with the Public Opinion Strategies firm out of Colorado, Golden, Colorado. And she's with us in Washington, D.C., and we'll share the results of the poll that were done through the Dovetail Partners, Katie Fernholz, along with Mark Jacobs and Beth Jackmain of Aiken County, Minnesota. So the poll is entitled Survey Results, What Do Minnesotans Value About Forests and Forestry? So it's an interesting poll. You may have seen some of the write-ups that were done in the papers. There's a lot of information there, and it's a lot of interest around the state of Minnesota on the results of the poll. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the logistics first of the webinar in case you have not done a webinar before. On the upper left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a chat pod. And so right below where the chat is, where we've already done some chatting, you can type in your questions if you have questions for Lori as we go along. And then press that arrow on the right-hand side, that kind of right-hand arrow, and that will bring it up so that we can see your question, and then Lori can answer the question during the program. The webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. The presentation will be less than that. So Lori's going to give her results of the survey she did, and you can type in questions she can answer as we go along, and then we'll have more questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So that's pretty much the logistics of how we operate. I had mentioned in the chat poll that if you would like to receive one continuing education credit for the webinar, place CF behind your name as you register, or FSP. So Certified Forester, you go through the national office, but we will send them the registration list. And then the stewardship plan writers will be automatically receive credits through our office here through Lisa Brewer. So if you have any questions on that, just give Lisa Brewer a call or email, and then she can work with you. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lori so that you have a better understanding of where she's coming from and a little bit about her poll. Lori Weigel is a partner with the Public Opinion Strategies in the Denver office of the firm. She has directed research efforts for hundreds of political and public affairs campaigns throughout the country, including twice assisting with efforts at the presidential level. In 2008, she polled for 2 successful statewide ballot measures, the Clean Water and Legacy Amendment in Minnesota, which we all know about, and which is the largest conservation finance measure ever in the United States. And then she also did a continuation of the Clean Ohio Fund, the largest economic generator in Ohio since its inception in 2000. She's been doing all kinds of polls for conservation organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Lands, National Wildlife Federation, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Wilderness Society, the League of Conservation Voters, and many others, which is very impressive. She graduated cum laude from Georgetown University, which in Washington, D.C., so she's back in her school home in foreign service with a BS in international politics. She's a hiker and sports fan, and she lives in Golden, Colorado with her husband and 2 young children. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, and I'm looking forward to hearing the results of the survey. Lori?
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction as well. So I would note that the survey that we conducted, you're going to see on that first screen there's 2 firm names, and I conducted this with David Metz of Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen, Metz and Associates. We had partnered together on the conservation finance measure there in Minnesota, and I've worked frequently on a number of different conservation-related issues around the country. And so our firms, there's a reason there's two of us. In the world of public opinion polling, when firms engage on candidates, they tend to go on one side of the aisle or the other. And when my firm polls for candidates, we poll for Republican candidates, and Dave's firm polls for Democratic candidates, although pretty much all of the work I do is in the public policy realm and not at the candidate level. So that's why you see that there. And that's one of the benefits that we felt like we brought to some of this data, was to be able to look at it from, from those two different worldviews. This was part, the findings that you're going to see today were part of a broader survey that touched on lots of different environmental issues facing the state of Minnesota. And we're also going to reference a 2007 survey that we did nationally, so representative of attitudes of all Americans regarding forests as well. So that's just a couple highlights and why you see two firm names there. So we talked to people last fall, November 11th through 15th, and here you'll see the methodology. We spoke to 605 registered voters throughout the state because a number of things that we were touching on had some public policy implications. That margin of error is plus or minus 4%, and again, that's for the overall sample. We're going to show you some different subgroups in here, and so obviously the sampling error would be larger for those. And I'm not sure if we have some comparisons, but there were some comparisons in the overall survey back to 2002. So let's just hit on some of the core attitudes that people are bringing to the table when they think about forests. And we started out very, very broadly and just said, overall, how important would you say Minnesota's forests are to the state's quality of life? So not to the state, broadly, but to the state's quality of life. And they were able to select whether they felt it was extremely important, very important, somewhat important, a little, or not at all. No one said not important at all. So that's why you don't see it seen here. And, again, these are very impressive numbers because honestly, we don't tend to get, that higher percentage in terms of extreme or very important on too many factors, but 91%, so essentially unanimity, saying that it's extremely or very important to the state's quality of life, and a majority saying that that forests are extremely important to the state's quality of life. Again, I mentioned that we looked at this across a number of different dimensions. So what you see here is this question segmented by partisan affiliation. And there are some distinctions. Democrats, interestingly, much higher in their intensity, 65% saying that Minnesota's forests are important, extremely important to the state's quality of life. That drops to 53% among independents and 41% among Republicans. Now, I'm focusing on that intensity number, but obviously when you add in extremely or very important, it's still overwhelming among all of these different partisan subgroups. So obviously, even among Republicans, it's 88% who are saying that it's at least very important to the state's quality of life. There were slight differences based on education level, with those with a postgraduate degree being somewhat less inclined to view the state's forests as extremely important, 41% there. But again, when you add those two numbers together, it's again overwhelming. And when you look at non-college versus college-educated, very close to margin of error there, so that 56% are saying it's extremely important, and 53% of college-educated respondents are saying the state's forests are extremely important to the quality of life in the state. A gender distinction. That's important, as some of you may have encountered in your daily life and personal relationships. Sometimes men and women view things differently. So we saw women being much more intense in terms of how they attribute forests being impacting the state's quality of life. 62% saying that it's extremely important, and again, 92% overall saying it's extremely or very important. and among men, just less intensity there. Still assigning it overall as being at least very important, but 46% indicating that they view the state's forests as extremely important to the state's quality of life. Honestly, there's often times when we'd love to be able to, ask follow-up questions. I'm not sure exactly what's attributing that distinction there, and so some of you may have, some thoughts on that. But again, when you combine extremely and very important, it's still very, very strong. But that gender difference shows up across partisan subgroups, across education levels, across regions of the state. We continue to see that gender distinction. And it's most notable among Republicans in Minnesota, where 28% of Republican men were saying that Minnesota's forests are extremely important to the state's quality of life, but it was 56% of Republican women that said that. And in fact, when we do broader conservation policy issues, we often see that Republican women are one of those, what we call sort of a swing group, that they are very, very open to conservation in general. They were one of the groups that that was targeted during the conservation finance measure there in the state because they assigned a greater degree of importance to water, land, natural areas in general, than did their male counterparts, and just had to be convinced that it was worth that sort of investment in terms of tax dollars in order to support that particular measure. There are also some regional distinctions. And I don't think anyone should be surprised that in the northeastern portion of the state, we saw that people were assigning a much higher proportion, saying that it was extremely important. So in the Northeast, it was at 71%. That dropped to 58% in the Northwest, 47% in the South, and then 53% in that Twin Cities metro area. Right there. But again, overwhelming majorities saying it's at least very important. We also asked I hope I'm looking at the right place in terms of any questions, so feel free to type those in. I think I can see it on my screen, hopefully. But we also asked a range of different attributes or benefits that Minnesota's forests have for the public, and asked respondents how important each item was to them personally as a benefit of forests. So all of these that you see here are put in rank order, although they were randomized when respondents heard them on the phone. So, but what they assigned the most importance to was providing a place for wildlife to live. 57% said that was extremely important to them personally as a benefit of Minnesota's forests. And then helping to keep the air clean, helping to keep the water clean. 54% saying those were extremely important, and then again, the overwhelming majority, over 90%, saying that it's extremely or very important for any of those three attributes. And there's a clear division there. So you've got wildlife, keeping the air clean, keeping the water clean. And in qualitative research, when we sit down and actually talk to people, it's interesting that they really do directly connect forests with that clean air, clean water. I don't know if it's whether or not everyone, read Dr. Seuss when they were young and, the Lorax got inculcated in everyone's brains. But, they can really tell you exactly why, even for water, why forests, how they filter the water, how they're important to that. They may not be able to tell you directly about, hard surfaces and polluted runoff and things like that, but they very much can connect the dots on those different attributes. Where we get a division, though, is when we go into the next layer of different benefits. So providing a source of good paying jobs, for example, at 39%, saying that's extremely important. Obviously, that's 15 points lower than keeping air, keeping water clean. Providing places for people to get away and relax, that was at 38%. And then helping to reduce global warming pollution at 36%. I would note on that particular attribute. We've seen a sort of a clear change in the environment in terms of people's attitudes towards reducing global warming pollution. Is the only attribute where we got some pushback. And you can see there 12% saying that it was not important to them personally, and another 17% saying that it was only somewhat important. So, and that tends to run across partisan lines, whereas Republicans and to a greater degree today, even independents, are saying that they, first of all, many saying that they don't necessarily believe that man-made pollution is causing global warming, and rating it as much less important as we've seen in the past. And that's really been a change over the last year. That we've seen and certainly occurred in this data in a couple of different places. Providing a place for recreation, and then supplying essential products like wood and paper. Also, other attributes that people had still a high level of intensity of saying it's extremely important, but somewhat lower than those top three. I would note, we don't have a specific slide here, but that northeastern region that I showed you before, they are rating all of these benefits of Minnesota's forests as higher than other areas of the state. So whether it was providing a place for wildlife to live or keeping air and water clean, on keeping water clean, for example, they were about 10 points higher than any other region of the state. But providing a source of good-paying jobs, they were at 46%. Saying that was extremely important compared to about 39% on average of the rest of the state. And then the only attribute that they were about the same on was providing a place for people to get away, obviously because many of them are surrounded by forests. So it is, less of an idea of going somewhere than it being right there in their area. But and then importantly, the biggest distinction was on supplying essential products like wood and paper. 46% in that northeastern region were saying that that was an extremely important benefit of Minnesota's forests, and that compares to, on average, 33% in the rest of the state. So, some distinctions there, but again, people really assigning high importance of all of those different benefits. There are also some differences based on partisan affiliation as well as on gender. And so I sort of verbalized that distinction on reducing global warming pollution, but it's a lot easier to see here. If you go down to the third from the bottom there, you can see that, and it's in red, so it's a little clearer to see, that Democrats were saying that helping to reduce global warming pollution as a benefit of forests was more important to them personally. And, then said the same among independents or Republicans. And then you had that inverse relationship for supplying essential products like wood and paper, where Republicans were more likely to say that was an extremely important benefit of Minnesota's forests. And it's interesting because partisan differences and those gender differences were actually one of the things that really sort of popped out in the data, much more so than even, I highlighted the Northeast being somewhat higher. But more so than, what type of community you lived in, anything related to age or ethnic background or income level or anything like that. The biggest distinctions we saw by gender were by keeping the air clean, keeping the water clean, and then helping to reduce global warming pollution. So that those sorts of ideas that connect to health, women were much more likely to assign those a high personal importance. So we saw those distinctions there based on some different subgroups, but overall it was interesting that this was very, very similar, again, to that 2007 national survey that I mentioned, which was among voters across the country, and where we asked people, again, a similar question where we said, talking about America's forests and the benefits they have for the public and how important each one was to them personally. And you can see that, again, some of these were phrased a little bit differently and in a different, and worded slightly differently than we did there in Minnesota. But, for example, helping to keep air and water clean, we didn't segment those out, but had those grouped together. But again, air and water being clean and providing a place for wildlife to live, again, in a top tier and a very distinct sort of set of benefits than people saw for anything else. So what does that tell us? It really indicates that when we're talking about forests to sort of the lay public, that, drawing that connection for them, really highlighting those attributes and the importance of forests for keeping the air and water clean and providing a place for wildlife to live are something that is most likely to resonate with them. So they may need additional education, or they may simply not see as great a personal importance for some of these other attributes like supplying essential products or providing a source of good paying jobs. And that it's you're on a sort of steadier ground when we're talking about the things at the top here rather than other things. It's also important to note that, and obviously, as you know, the rest of America, not always like Minnesota. So these ideas about supplying essential products or providing a source of good paying jobs didn't resonate even as close to as strongly as they did in Minnesota. So, the folks living across the country don't have that sort of more direct connection to the idea that forests are a place that, people work and that we have that connection of working for us. We also, in the national survey, it really became clear exactly what the priorities were, because we had people, what's called a forced choice question. We forced them to choose between all those different benefits. So while they were saying lots of these were very important, when we said, okay, but which one of these benefits of America's forests do you think is most important? And then we gave them a second choice as well. And you can see really no distinction between that place for wildlife to live and helping to keep the air and water clean. So again, this is nationally, but I think we would have had the same dynamic there in Minnesota. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. Going back to Minnesota, we asked one more question that we wanted to highlight today, and that was we asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with the idea that with sound forest management, we can continue the current level of wood and paper production from Minnesota's forests while still protecting and improving forest health. And we had 85% agreement, 55% strongly agreeing. In fact, support was just overwhelming across the board. We didn't pull out some distinctions by subgroups here because it was so high and so intense among virtually everyone, and almost no one disagreeing with that idea. Which tells you that, again, I think Minnesotans are further along on sort of the learning curve about forests than our voters nationally. So in terms of communication, and that's was one of the main goals of the survey broadly and what we saw here in forests, how to talk to the public. And again, I would stress the public and not necessarily decision makers, elected officials within the environmental community. We're talking about that much broader public. Obviously, people are recognizing the importance of forests in Minnesota, and that is something that they clearly value and find of personal importance. In communications, we would want to stress the benefits for air and water quality and then wildlife habitat. And I'd say those are really, that's a close number too. So both of those being something that people are recognizing as personally important to them, and that really followed along with all the stuff we've done nationally. Those economic benefits of forests are certainly something that people recognize, and that tends to be even more true in the Northeastern area, but it's not sort of that central message point. It's not what we would highlight first and foremost. Again, we go back to that other bullet saying, what would we stress? We'd stress air and water quality and then wildlife habitat. And then it's sort of a no-brainer for people. I mean, they understand that sound management can both preserve the economic and the environmental benefits of the state's forests. And it's something that we've seen nationally as well when we just think about the economy, and we ask some questions. Not not too much earlier than this survey, back in late September, early October, where we talked to people about a broader sort of economic rationale for conservation and said, do you have to choose between, sort of a good, solid economy and protecting the environment, or can we do both? And people are overwhelmingly say that we can do both, and we never want to be in a situation where we're saying, choose one versus the other. Because they really think that we ought to be doing both and that we can do it as possible. So that was that really is the conclusions. I can flip back to any of these slides. I think I still have control on this and talk about. And I've got a question on methodology. So what we did here. No, we didn't do it based on numbers in a phone book. What we did was there's actually a fairly extensive voter file in the state of Minnesota that we used over the course of the conservation finance campaign and used here as well. The benefit of that is it does incorporate cell phone numbers into that database, and so they were drawn randomly but proportionally throughout the state. So it's representative of key demographics such as age, gender. That it was quoted by county, so that we made sure we had the appropriate number of interviews by county throughout the state. And less so on, there was another question about age distinctions. I'm not sure if everyone can see this or not, so forgive me if I'm being redundant and repeating some of the questions there. In general, we had voters under the age of 30 tended to be they tended to be a little more responsive in general to any sort of conservation-related issues. It was interesting. They were more likely to rate all of the different benefits of forests as something that was personally important to them. But overall, when people thought about how important forests were to the quality of life, or on the sound management question, very few age distinctions there. So it was really sort of under 30s that were most likely to say that all those different attributes of forests were important to them personally. But and then beyond that, there weren't a great deal of age distinctions. So I'm sorry. Let me go back to. So in terms of, James, I might have you expand on your question in terms of doing what they say. It's a good question because he was asking, was there anything to measure behavior of individuals versus attitudes? Well, that's always, for pollsters, the hardest test is when we actually have a vote come up, because we're asking people how will they vote, and then they come back and they actually do it. So we get graded a little bit on an actual behavior and what they're doing there. So I guess in terms of what they're actually doing and engaging with forests, we didn't have any questions that asked that particularly. We know in general that, that even in the Twin Cities area, people talk about going to the boundary waters. They talk about recreating and visiting. We have much higher percentages of sportsmen in Minnesota than we do in lots of other states. I'm sure you guys are well aware. And in general, there's just sort of a different appetite for and engagement with the outdoors. I don't know that we asked about necessarily recreating in forests in particular, though. So maybe you can expand on that question if I'm not capturing what you're trying to ask. A place to get away and a place to recreate. Well, people will tell us that one of the things that they value, whether it's about forests or whether it's about the outdoors in general, is that idea of just sort of an opportunity to disengage. So there's, whether it's not having the TV on. They talk about the peace and quiet of nature. They talk about being somewhere where they are not necessarily going for a hike or participating in a particular recreation activity, but just sort of a place to unwind and relax. And so I think that's what, and they talk about it as a place to get away, sort of from everyday life. And that's one of the phrases that in the extensive qualitative research that we've done across the country that people say they value about the outdoors, and in particular forests. And so, but they do tend to think of it as somewhat different than as a place to recreate necessarily, because they tend to think of that as a particular activity that they might be engaged in. And then Kelly was asking about registered voters generally being better informed on issues. So, yeah, I mean, granted, especially in Minnesota, you do have a sort of well-educated public overall. So, of sort of the massive distinctions that we see in some other states where there's a large proportion of, or a significant proportion of the population that's not registered to vote and not actively as engaged. But, in general, by education level, we didn't see, and I pointed out in that one place on that one question, we didn't tend to see sort of a massive distinction in terms of how folks were responding based on education level, for example. But in general, voters do tend to be somewhat more engaged. They tend to be a little bit better educated, better aware. Education level, age, and gender actually tend to be the most determinative of how well-informed respondents are in terms of particular news and public policy issues. But, I think this is sort of, the questions we were asking here were a little bit beyond that and really sort of attaching to people's core values and beyond the question, on sound management techniques. I mean, talking about these particular benefits and how people, perceive forests, I think that goes, I think that would be very much the same whether we had been talking to adults 18 and over or talking to registered voters. I just haven't seen that big a difference in terms of that sort of, core values type questions. And so James is elaborating, maybe doing could be actions in support of the attitude as opposed to more simply holding the attitude. Right. And so if there were a particular ask that we were asking people to make, we can see a distinction. I was just actually presenting some numbers on public transit, and actually some folks from Minnesota were here talking about that as well. And, so we saw, for example, people really valuing public transit, but then when we asked them would they be willing to pay a small increase in taxes, it dropped about 20 points. So, yes, there can be a clear distinction in terms of people's willingness to, and, one of the hardest you can ask people to make is, the willingness to pay out of their own pocket for something and invest in something. So were we to ask sort of a harder question on forests, like, would you be willing to, pay a small increase in taxes or pay some sort of fee or something like that? Yeah, I think we would see some sort of distinction in terms of willingness to do versus willingness to say this is something they value. But obviously, that was sort of the, we saw in Minnesota with the conservation effort that in the ballot measure that people were willing to sort of back up that's something that they valued with a willingness to pay. Sorry, let me go back to. Be interesting to do a similar poll for the teachers in both the grade schools and high schools in northern Minnesota. That would be interesting. We haven't done a sort of an educator survey before, so. We did not have a question about wild natural areas in the Minnesota survey. So, no, Susan, we didn't ask that in particular. It's interesting that, I'm always learning about language and how to communicate. Wild is something that that we have tested as just a word in terms of, and actually I did a major project in more rural areas of the U.S. one of those being in Bend, Oregon, which obviously a very forested area. And it was interesting. Even among active outdoor recreationists and sportsmen, we got a lot of pushback on the term wild because people were saying that it was something that was a little bit scary and made them think of jungles, Africa, stuff like that. So we tend to avoid the word wild in a lot of our communication today. I can't remember the particular reason we were testing it in that national survey, though. But it's just something to keep in your heads when you think about how to communicate the benefits of these undeveloped areas. Any thoughts on why with more education, that's one of your slides, individuals have a less extreme interest in the importance of forest values? I think it's a little more of a function of a survey methodology issue than it's necessarily we tend to see people with a postgraduate degree tend to rate lots of things a little more modestly than people with lower education levels, and that's true on lots of different things. So I think that's somewhat of a function of that. It's a small segment of the population. It's about 10% of the population. So, it is 10% of the population. So I wouldn't get too hung up on why it was somewhat lower. I think the more important number was the non-college versus college educated, that they were all valuing, and all of those numbers in terms of the benefits of forest were within margin of error of each other on non-college versus college. One more question. Is there any info on attitudes of private forest landowners versus public in general? I don't have that. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else on the call would be aware of any other surveys, but we would not have had a significant sample size of those individuals to be able to compare them within this survey. But there may have been work done. Often that type of work is done among academicians, so I'm not aware of anything, though. Any other questions?
Okay, this is Mike Cranky. This has been very interesting. Lori, thank you very much for your presentation and answering so many questions.
Great questions. Thank you for...
It was very interesting. And I appreciate your expertise in looking at it from a national perspective, as well as your understanding of the Minnesota population and giving us results from both those perspectives. So
yeah, and I put my email up on the screen, so if anybody has anything occurred to them later on and they want to follow up, you can feel free to, shoot me an email as well.
Do you have any other questions? Otherwise, what I'd like to do now is just invite participants to attend other webinars with SFEC down the road. This is the first in a series of 10 webinars. So the next one is the Minnesota Forest Resources Council landscape level updates with Lindbergh Ekela with the Minnesota Forest Resource Council is on Tuesday. The rest of our webinars will be at 9 o'clock in the morning, 9 to 10. So go to the SFEC website to register and look at the full slate of offerings. A couple of programs coming up in Bemidji, Grand Rapids, April 14th and 15th. Forest and Climate Change with Lee Freilich, and that's a very popular program and a lot of content there. So feel free to sign up for that program. Another interesting program coming up is Stewardship for Early Successional Habitat Birds within Minnesota's forested region on May 5th. That will be at the Cloquet Forestry Center. We have a few other programs besides that: Forest Products Utilization and Marketing on July 27th. September 14th, Intermediate Stand Treatments. And we're also working on our fall calendar right now. So keep track of the programs and attend those that you would like to go to, and let me know if you have others that you feel are important throughout the state of Minnesota, and we'll try to work with you and our partners to develop the programs. So Once again, Lori, thanks for your time
Oh,
and
thank
your
you.
excellent survey and presentation, and wishing you well with your work. And thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar.
Yeah, and James asked a question lastly about a copy of the slides. And I
Sorry.
think, Michael, you might be able to check with Catherine,
Okay.
sorry, and
Katie?
just see, yeah, Katie, sorry, hello. It's Catherine on her emails. And see if that's able to be distributed, because it's obviously it's their product, and so I don't like to send things out without their permission. But I
Okay,
assume you have
Katie.
everyone.
Katie had requested that your program be on the URL for the
Okay.
SFEC website. So within the one-page logistics page that I sent out, there is a link on the bottom where you can click on, and Lori's program will be available for you to view. As far as getting a copy of the slides yourself, you need to contact Katie Fernholz in order to do that. If you do not have her contact information, let me know by email, and then I will send it to you. So, anything else here? The user survey. Yeah, Susan mentioned the National Woodland User Survey, and I'm assuming...
Oh, great.
that
So that'd
would
be for as another,
for the survey?
yeah, another survey out there. Great.
Okay, thank you there, Susan. TY, what is TY?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thanks again, everyone, and talk to you later. Thanks,
Thank
Lori.
you.
Oh, I forgot. We do have a survey that we decided
Ironically.
on doing at the end. This is the one that we did last time we did a webinar. So if you have a few minutes, just feel free to plug in, and then we'll give us some results for the next webinar, a series of webinars.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have just about everybody.